Thanks for your patience. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm a professor of anthropology here at IU, and I'm also the director of the Russian and East European Institute, which is located in this building in the Hamilton Luger School. I have been doing research in Ukraine since 1995. I never meant to focus on civil society. To be honest, the first time I went to Ukraine as a young graduate student in anthropology, I was getting my degree at the University of Illinois, I probably couldn't have told you what civil society was. And it was the Ukrainians that I met starting in 1995 who taught me what is civil society, why is it so important. And so I wanted to share a few of those insights with you today. And why is my talk titled The Rise and Rise of Civil Society? Because you would usually say the rise and fall, right, of X, Y, and Z. Civil society in Ukraine has been rising and rising and rising ever since 1991 when the country became independent from the Soviet Union. Why the sort of preface part of the title is how are they doing it is if you've been paying attention over the last week, I'm not sure how much of this is actually in the Western news because I've been reading the Ukrainian news about the war. But if you have seen any stories about how people are surviving, Professor Melnick was just asking, people are in Kharkiv, what are they doing? How are they surviving? Do they have food? Do they have water? Are people still in the city? And the answer is yes, and they are surviving together. And they have perfected the art of caring for one another and for creating communities of concern. So I want to talk about how that happened. So what is civil society? There are different ways to think about, a definition of civil society. A lot of political theorizing has focused on civil society, what it looks like under different regimes, how is civil society connected to democracy, and all of these are really important conversations. But for our purposes, I think I sort of wanted to ponder with you a few of these possible definitions of civil society. One that I think is actually a pretty good one is to think about civil society as a democratizing space where citizens can convene outside the watchful eye of the state, okay? And so this kind of gives the idea that civil society can be a really important place of not so much resistance, but citizens asserting their wishes for what kind of society they want to live in and build, and to have freedom to do that outside of state control. Sometimes it's productive to look at civil society as a mediating force between the individual and the state. So in other words, civil society can be a space where individuals can kind of lobby for themselves, right? They can self-advocate, they can self-organize and bring things to the state on the behalf of the collective. So again, there's this idea of negotiation, this idea of democratizing, and this idea of self-organization around common desires and common interests. Some people want to look at civil society as an alternative economy. That's a valid way to look at civil society as well. A lot of exchange happens, right, when people are self-organizing. Sometimes it's not monetary exchange, it's not exchange that's built on sort of the formal economy, but it's more of an informal economy and type of exchange. So these are all some ways to look at civil society, just to get us on the same page. So with that, I want to have a little bit of back and forth with you all. I know there's been a lot of lectures today, not as much discussion. Can you think of some examples of civil society in action? That can be from your own experience, that can be from things that you have studied. What's an example of civil society in action? Yeah.
I mean, you could talk about just community groups, meetings, organizations. mean, I guess you could do it as simple Monday dance like the Boy Scouts.
Boy Scouts.
Maybe not the Boy Scouts, because I don't know
Yeah.
how much assertion of, societal values. I don't know. That
Right.
could theoretically be like a concept for anyone.
Sure. I mean, any kind of community organization, right, where people are coming together around a common interest. So Boy Scouts could be one. Frankly, a book club could be, an example of civil society. Yeah.
How about the Bloomington Quilt Guild?
Absolutely.
Whereupon, not only do people share their work, but they have access to workshops so that they're learning and encouraging one another to just keep doing what they're doing.
Absolutely. Great example. Yeah.
Worker unions.
Absolutely. Worker unions, right? Trade unions. Laborers, right? Labor unions, people organizing around either common grievances or common demands, common interests, collective bargaining, right? Yeah.
Stuff like maybe like the local food not bombs.
Yeah. Yeah. Local food not bombs. Tell us more about it.
It's like a sort of like a group where they sort of like a food kitchen, but like done more like horizontally.
Okay.
Like that.
So a form of horizontal governance. People, sounds like a lot of mutual care is taking place there, making sure that people, people aren't going hungry. Yeah, these are all great examples of civil society in action. So either drawing on these examples that you've offered or thinking of other ones, what does civil society do for people? People who are involved in these kinds of civil society groups or initiatives, what do they get out of it?
Outlets to express grievances.
Yeah, outlets to express grievances.
Oh, I was just gonna say their voice can be heard.
Yeah, their voice can be heard, right? They can state their desires. They can state their point of view.
I was going to say encouragement in various ways.
Yeah, I really like the way you're thinking about this, Monica. And you talked about the Quilt Guild, where people are sharing know-how, resources, access, right? And, like you say, encouragement, right? So all of these things are really crucial. If I'm going to take part in a civil society organization in some form, I want something out of it, right? Like it's for the greater good, right? We're thinking about the common good and greater interest, but we're also thinking about, what are my interests as an individual, right? Why would I spend my time doing this, right? When there are many other demands on my time. Here's a little bit of a maybe provocative question, but it's important to ask. What does civil society do for the state?
I mean, I think on the same topic of grievances, it allows the state to hear and access the grievances of the people, and creates in that way an intermediary between larger bodies of governance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it gives an outlet, right? A place to collect feedback. I think that's a generous reading. It assumes that the state cares, right? Yeah.
I think it sometimes performs the function of the state. So services that are not provided by the state but are actually necessary often are performed by the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say it shows a need. It shows the state where needs are.
Yeah. Right. Right. It shows the state a need, but it also fills that need, right? In many cases. I'm going to get rid of this. Tomorrow we can throw our masks off if we wish to. I want to throw it that far.
Support the state,
Yeah.
now in Ukraine, all those volunteers, they are supporting.
Absolutely.
Villages, small towns.
Right.
They are
That's
supporting the state.
right. So it's two sides of the same coin, right? I think I'm going to get into this, and I got to kind of. It's too fun talking to you. I've got to blast through some things here, but so there's multiple ways to look at it, but that's two, right? And some people would say, well, when people organize and they do all these things themselves and they provide for one another, right? And they collect grievances and they help one another, they're letting the state off the hook, right? They're doing the state's work for the state because they're taking care of one another, they're redistributing resources, they're making sure people aren't falling through the cracks. But in times of crisis, thank goodness we have a strong civil society, right? Because when the state is in crisis, when the state is in shambles, when your country is being bombed by another country, you want a strong civil society so that people can take care of one another, while, let's say the leaders have other things on their hands, right? And so that's kind of two sides of the same coin. And this is very relevant to places like Ukraine. This is sort of a reminder to myself to follow up on that point precisely and talk about the really astonishing ways that people on the ground in Ukraine right now. So come on in. This is a drop in, drop out affair. So people who are on the ground in Ukraine in places like Kharkiv, who haven't left, right, either by choice or because they simply couldn't leave in time. I'm in touch daily with my friends who are university professors, right? They have kids. They're spending their days in basements in either their own apartment building or an adjoining apartment building. And there is this amazing way in which their neighbors, sort of everybody who's still around has organized getting everybody fed, getting all the pets walked. You don't realize, what, I know people here have pets. Yeah, and you too, Monica. But you don't realize until you're in this crisis situation, how much time and energy it takes to feed a pet, give medicine to a sick pet, and walk a pet when bombs are being dropped on your city, right? And so all of these things are organized in just an amazing way. Social media has a huge, huge role to play here. A lot of people are using Telegram, Viber, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger. There are other ones that I don't even know the names of, but ways that people are communicating, getting the word out, what's happening, right? So you'll literally see a telegram alert, Kharkiv, air raid warning, everybody take shelter, right? It's instantaneous. You'll see things come up on social media about, this so-and-so orphanage is running really low on diapers. Anybody got extra diapers? Yeah, I do. Okay, where can I meet you? Great, blah, 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 So it's like these instantaneous kind of connections that people are making. And these are just some examples on social media. This is something, I can't even remember who sent me this now, but one of our students from IU is in Ukraine right now. She made it to the Carpathian Mountains, and so somebody sent me this list that is restaurants that are feeding internally displaced people for free in various towns and cities in the Carpathians. And they were like, I know your student's there, send this to her, maybe it would be useful. So this is not only a local phenomenon, right? Like a local kind of civil society that's been built from the ground up. It's also become very international, and I think that social media has a lot to do with that. So this is actually my favorite definition of civil society. We talked about, others is it an alternative economy. I'm so tired, I've already forgotten what the other ones were. Okay, a mediating force between the individual and the state, a place where citizens can convene outside the watchful eye of the state. But and now we're in Chernobyl. I really like, goodness gracious, you've just seen the entire presentation. I can sit down now. It's not letting me go back. There we are. That's my favorite definition of civil society, the self-organization of society. And that can mean so many different things in so many different political and historical contexts. Okay, so a little history here, because the point of my talk is how did Ukrainians get so good at civil society? Well, they had to. They didn't have much of a choice. Ukraine has been an independent country this round, shout out to Polina, since 1991. She talked about the fact that Ukraine has a long history of national identity and nationhood, but the round we're sort of more concerned with started in 1991. when 92% of the population voted, yes, we want to form an independent state separate from the Soviet Union. Well, that was great, but it was followed by economic collapse, and really a series of economic crises plagued this new state for at least its first 10 years. And so the state welfare system collapsed. If you know anything about socialism, you know that socialism has baked in social programs, right? Robust social supports, a robust social safety net for the population, and particularly for the most vulnerable, right? And so people with disabilities, the elderly, people who can't work, are unemployed, families with lots of children, families with small children, get a lot of state support, right? That's part of the ethos of socialism, is that there should be a fair and even starting point for everybody in the population. And so that dropped out, the bottom of that dropped out. Maybe on paper it was still there, right? Maybe the social safety net and the socialist welfare system was still on paper, but it would literally be like, for example, some of the people that I know, a mom taking care of a child with a disability, she at this time, early 90s, was supposed to get some compensation because she, couldn't work because she had to take care of this child. And the compensation was supposed to make up for what would have been a salary. It would be like $2 a month. So, it wasn't nearly enough. And so people really had to scramble, right, in this in these conditions of economic collapse. Polina mentioned before that after the Soviet Union fell, there was really high rates of unemployment. In Ukraine, 3/4 of the unemployed were women. And so really dire straits in a lot of families in economic crisis. Switching gears a little bit to tell just a couple stories. When I went to Ukraine in the mid-90s to start my dissertation in anthropology, I wanted to study Chernobyl. Like, that used to be the thing, right? Ukraine, Chernobyl. End of story, full stop. I'm being a little flippant here. Chernobyl is really important in Ukrainian history, and I think it's actually really important part of the story of how and why Ukraine became independent. But I was kind of fascinated by Chernobyl and people's ideas about how to stay healthy after Chernobyl. So I go to Ukraine and I'm asking all these people, about Chernobyl, and I'm meeting all these people who have had either their or their children's health affected by Chernobyl. And I'm just meeting these amazing women. And I'm meeting women who are well-educated, highly energetic, very resourceful, but they're unemployed. They have problems. And they have banded together with other citizens who have similar problems, and they're solving them together. So I kept running into all of these civic organizations, social organizations, grassroots organizations that were taking care of people who were falling through the cracks during this economic crisis. And so many of those had been founded by women and were led by women. And so I switched my dissertation topic from Chernobyl to basically women's social activism and how women in Ukraine in the mid-90s were building Ukrainian civil society. This is just a picture of some of the people that I was meeting. At first, I was meeting a lot of these activists through the Chernobyl kind of topic. And this is an example. These were some scientists who were working on some really cool, I won't get into it, but they were really cool scientists. And they were also supporting each other, and they were supporting people whose health had been affected by Chernobyl. But then my networks grew, people introduced me to other people, and I started meeting a range of activists. Here's another Chernobyl activist, very famous biologist named Natalia Preobrazhenskaya. who created a lot of kind of foundations and supports for Chernobyl children, and she traveled around the world talking about, you know, Chernobyl's effects on young people. Again, my networks are expanding. I'm meeting more people who are building Ukrainian civil society. A lot of them are in the disability rights movement. A lot of them are supporting sick children. So this is just kind of to jar my brain. I can't resist pointing out that this is my little boy, who's now 20 years old. He was 1, he just learned to walk. That's a project that I was doing on healthy food after Chernobyl, so I always trot out this picture as this healthy toddler. So yeah, it was a good thing that people in Ukraine were really excited and interested in building civil society, because the international community wanted them to do that too. And so there was a lot of support coming in from various international foundations, you know, groups that were concerned with building democracy in these formerly Soviet states. And they were really encouraging people to form organizations, right? And to be a little cynical about it, we saw what we might call the NGOization of civil society. So a lot of Western foundations that were coming in were assuming that founding a non-governmental organization, right, that had a charter and that had, you know, rules and accounting books and, you know, all of these ways to kind of account for one's activity was the best way to help build civil society in Ukraine. So there was lots of grant money that was very donor driven, right? And so the priorities of whether it was, you know, let's say the Soros Foundation was one, or USAID, right? Or maybe smaller kind of women's foundations in the West. They brought sort of their priority topics to Ukraine and then gave out funds for people to, you know, sort of answer the call, and found organizations. And so, again, there's been quite a lot of critique of this, you know, donor-driven civil society that maybe didn't take into account what were the local kind of real needs. But, you know, I sort of take a middle ground, and I think, you know, a lot of good was done. And a lot of people were supported that really needed the support and did some really great work on the ground. But one of the sort of ideologies that comes around with building civil society, particularly in places that have a socialist past, is that we want to make people self-sufficient, right? We want to create independent, self-sufficient citizens that don't have to rely on the state. And so that kind of ideology was built into a lot of the civil society building programs. And so that's kind of the cynical take that we talked about earlier, where, is civil society just letting the state off the hook, right? If we're building these independent citizens that don't rely on the state, does that mean that the state can just retract and, you know, not support people, not provide social safety nets because all of these self-organized groups are doing it for us, right? Is one way to look at it. There was also an assumption when these foundations were coming into the country that this is something totally new. These post-socialist citizens don't know anything about civil society. They've lived in a, you know, under total state control, and they don't know how to do anything on their own. Well, not exactly true, right? Because in the Soviet Union and other socialist states in Eastern Europe, there was a plethora, right, of ways that people participated in various communities. Okay, maybe they were forced to. Maybe it wasn't exactly a choice. But people did participate in the Young Pioneers organization, right? They did participate in the communist youth, the so-called Komsomol. You mentioned trade unions. That was certainly a thing, right, in the Soviet Union. People did have common interest clubs, right? Like everybody was a member of, I don't know, the bowling group or the sewing, the sewing group, or the 18th century literature group, whatever it was. And so there were these fora for people to organize. Yes, it was tightly controlled, right? Yes, it was definitely not outside of the socialist state, but people did, organize. They did come together, and they did have this quasi-civil society-esque experience. So it wasn't like people had not had any idea. I'm going to move on here because we're running out of time. And I'll let you read this, and I'll tell you about some of the groups that I worked with. So I told you that I never went to study civil society. I didn't even know what it was. And then I started meeting all of these activists, right, who were organizing and demanding higher pensions for people with disabilities, for example, or demanding more respect from fellow citizens as elderly retirees. And so they were really exercising what the theorist Nancy Fraser has called the politics of redistribution and the politics of recognition. And I think those are two really key aspects of what civil society is and what it does, right? It helps people advocate collectively for a bigger piece of the pie, and it helps people advocate collectively for more recognition, more respect, more attention as deserving citizens. And so, I worked, and I've written a couple of books on this, but I worked mainly with groups that were defending the rights of people with either chronic illnesses or people with disabilities. And so I saw firsthand the huge role that gender was playing in civil society building in Ukraine. I mentioned that 3/4 of the unemployed after the Soviet Union fell in Ukraine were women. They were highly educated, highly qualified. Many of them, had been teachers, engineers, so they had skills that they could put to use in new ways. And there was grant money to do so. So when the Orange Revolution rolls around, and in the previous talk, Polina Vlasenko talked quite a bit about the Orange Revolution. So the Orange Revolution was in 2004, and this was basically huge protests, mostly in Kiev, but in other parts of Ukraine also, protesting a rigged election. So the candidate that the Russian Federation had basically planted to become president of Ukraine got most of the vote in the first round of elections, but it was rigged. And people came out in the streets, and the party of the opposition, their color was orange, and that's why it became the Orange Revolution. Yeah. I cited you on the Orange Revolution. So, I feel like this is where we really saw civil society really start to take root on a huge scale, and people really coming together in protest on the Maidan, which later became very famous 4 years later, in the next kind of wave of protests in Ukraine, which was the Euromaidan, or the so-called Revolution of Dignity. As Polina mentioned, the Euromaidan really was kind of the second attempt of the Russian Federation to plant their guy, plant their candidate. But it was a little more complicated than that, because what happened this time was that the guy, this sounds like a soap opera, the guy who didn't win in 2004 because it was rigged, came back, new and improved, and actually did get elected. But then he really ignored the will of the people of Ukraine and refused to sign an agreement with the EU. I'm probably not getting all this right. It wasn't an accession agreement, economic
No,
agreement.
It was the economic and also association.
Okay, so
I
the
think it was called association.
association
but
agreement.
it included mostly economic stuff.
Right, right. So the will of the people was that, as Polina said, you know, we're choosing Europe, right? And Yanukovych just ignored that and basically got run out of the country and had to flee to Russia. The Euromaidan turned violent. There were, you know, over 100 protesters that were killed by snipers and others. And it really became a symbol of Ukraine's choice for Europe. And I'd like to invite Polina to talk more about it, because why I mention it is the really unbelievable way that people came together on the Maidan, provided food for protesters, provided medical care, as she mentioned, for protesters. Protesters who were injured couldn't go to the hospital because they would be jailed, right? So they had to seek alternative medical care. So you have these whole brigades of medical professionals who are not working their day jobs. They're coming to take care of the injured on the Maidan. And you have people like Polina who are sitting in hospitals when some did go to the hospital, right, because kind of no alternative, making sure that they don't get dragged off by the police. So do you want to say more about, like, this talk is about civil society and taking care of one another in communities of concern. So tell us a little bit about how that felt for you as someone on the ground.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, and also you mentioned...
Stand up and turn around.
Yeah, stand up again. It was the second time it happened in Ukraine, so I took part in the Orange Revolution as well, but I was a kid, I was 14 years old. And when the Orange Revolution happened, we also stayed like on the square, and there were tents. But Maidan was much more, that it happened on another level in terms of the amount of people who actually did not stay on the square 24/7, how they contributed, how they helped. So it was kind of a small village in the middle of the town that was independent from the city's administration, and it was supported by people who were outside of it, who maybe stayed home during night. They didn't sleep in tents on the square, but during the day they assisted. They did everything to maintain the protest and to prevent police from taking over the square, and also to support people in the square so that they can keep being there and occupying the square. So some of the things I know that were maybe important is that it was very cold. It was in the winter, so winter is in Ukraine, it's cold, you can see like snow there, but it started in November, but it lasted until February, and so these shootings that you mentioned, they happened already February 20th, so it was actually my birthday.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so my mom, she made like a tattoo with this number, like February 20, on her arm because of that. So it was this time, yeah. Okay, so it was very cold, and so people would use any possible means to stay warm. So people would, I don't know, provide tea and coffee, and then they would have fires that would heat to help them keep warm, stay warm, and I don't know what else to add. Yeah, so what you mentioned about the injuries. So when these clashes, they usually happened at night. So the police would, during the day, they wouldn't touch them, but then during night, they would try to, is it called storm? Do you say storm? Storm. Yeah, they would storm the square every night. And so during this time, of course, people would throw Molotov cocktails into them, and they would put their cars on fire. And at some point, and the police, of course, would shoot back, and they were using weapons. There were snipers sitting all over the square, so you can see there's a lot of buildings around it. So all of these buildings were occupied by snipers, and they would kind of kill people in the crowd. And then, when that happened, like the subway would stop, the metro was not running, the restaurants and cafes would also close. People were just watching it online because all of the media channels, of course, were on the side of protesters. So I don't remember, maybe there were some channels who weren't, but no one watched them. So media was showcasing what was happening on the square, and so during the night people would just emotionally kind of support, and then during the day they would provide like the necessary infrastructure for that to function. Yeah, and then healthcare, you mentioned.
These networks of people caring for one another and organizing, food and medicine and emergency supplies that we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine right now. And it didn't surprise me, but I'm always amazed by the fortitude. And I'm also amazed by the fact that when I message my friends who are in bomb shelters in Kharkiv and ask how they are, they say, I'm fine, but over there, it's really bad. I'm fine, but my friend needs this. And just the level of concern that people have for one another it's very inspiring. Let's see, there was something else I wanted to end with, but I think I'll leave it there. So any questions? I think we have like 2 minutes before our next speaker.
One would hope that we as Americans can take Ukrainian civil society as an example, because we are becoming less and less civil.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's a great point.
I don't mean to end on it.
No, right.
But, I think there are a lot of lessons we're learning about the importance of unity that we seem to have forgotten.
Well, thank you for your attention. Thanks so much.